On October the 13th, 1972, a small chartered plane carrying 45 people took off from Montevideo, Uruguay. On board were members of the Old Christians Club rugby team, their friends and family members. They were headed to Santiago, Chile for a friendly match. None of them could have imagined what their journey would soon become. For the players and their loved ones, this was meant to be a routine trip filled with laughter, anticipation, and the thrill of competing in another country. They spoke about the game ahead, shared snacks, and looked forward to the hospitality that awaited them in Santiago. For many, it was their first time flying over the mighty Andes, and they marvelled at the snow-capped peaks from their windows. It was supposed to be a moment of excitement and adventure. Never did they think their lives would be rewritten in history books as one of the most extraordinary survival stories of all time. None of them could have imagined that their journey would turn into one of the most harrowing survival stories in modern history. The plane, a Fairchild 227D, was not built for long-haul flights across mountains. It was a twin-engine turboprop designed for short regional flights. The crew included Colonel Julio Ferradas, an experienced pilot, and Lieutenant Colonel Dante Laguerra. Weather conditions in the Andes were unpredictable, with clouds often obscuring the mountain peaks. As the aircraft approached the Andes on October 13th, the pilots miscalculated their position. Believing they had already cleared the mountains, they began descending. In reality, the plane was still deep in the Andes range. At 3:34 p.m, the plane slammed into a mountainside at 12,000 feet. The impact tore the fuselage apart. The tail section was ripped away, as were both wings. The nose section separated. Out of 45 passengers and crew, 12 died instantly. Those who survived were left in a mangled fuselage surrounded by snow and jagged peaks. Many were severely injured. They had no winter clothing, no survival equipment, and very little food. Their supplies amounted to a few chocolate bars, some wine, and small snacks brought on board. The reality of their situation was almost impossible to grasp. The survivors faced brutal conditions. Daytime temperatures hovered around freezing, while nighttime temperatures plunged to minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. They were at an altitude where oxygen levels were thin, leaving them weak and disorientated. Snow blinded them, and avalanches loomed as constant threats. At high altitude in the Andes, the sun's rays are extremely intense. When the sunlight reflects off the vast white snowfields, it creates a condition called snow blindness, essentially a sunburn of the cornea. Without sunglasses or protective eyewear, survivors' eyes are exposed to constant blinding glare during the day. This causes severe pain, temporary vision loss, and disorientation, making it even harder to navigate or search for food in an already brutal environment. Sunglasses with UV protection help shield the eyes, reduce glare, and allow people to move safely in those bright, snowy conditions. It's the very reason why mountaineers, explorers, and people in snow-covered areas wear dark glasses or goggles to protect against the invisible but devastating power of ultraviolet rays reflected by the snow. The fuselage, which had remained largely intact, became their makeshift shelter. They arranged seats for bedding, stuffed cracks with luggage to block wind, and huddled together for warmth. Despite their efforts, frostbite and hypothermia set in quickly. The injured moaned in agony. Within days, 5 more passengers had succumbed to their injuries. They tried to conserve their scant food, rationing small bites of chocolate and sips of wine. But after only a few days, their supplies ran out. With no vegetation, no animals, and no possibility of rescue in sight, they were faced with starvation. In their desperation, they were forced into a choice no human being should ever have to make. It was a decision that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had to do the unthinkable. On the 11th day, they heard a radio broadcast on a small transistor radio salvaged from the wreck. At first, it gave them hope. Search efforts were ongoing. But a few days later, the devastating announcement came. The search was officially called off. The authorities declared there was no chance of finding survivors in such an unforgiving wilderness. The group was crushed. Many wept, others raged, but some resolved to fight harder to stay alive. They realized no one was coming. Their survival depended entirely on themselves. In a strange way, the announcement was both devastating and liberating. For some, it brought clarity. The false hope of waiting for a rescue was gone. There would be no search planes on the horizon, no sudden appearance of helicopters overhead. That chapter had closed. And while it was heartbreaking, it also forced them to face reality head on. Now, their minds had shifted from waiting to acting. If they were going to live, it would be because they found the strength, courage, and ingenuity to endure the impossible. For a few of them, that grim realization lit a fire of determination. If no one else could save them, then they had to save themselves. Help was not coming. On the 17th day, a new disaster struck. As the survivors slept in the fuselage, an avalanche swept down the mountain and buried their shelter. 8 more people were killed instantly, smothered in snow. The remaining survivors clawed their way out, traumatized and exhausted. Now, only 19 remained. Buried under snow for days, they nearly suffocated. When they finally dug out, the fuselage was half filled with packed snow. Supplies, already scarce, were further diminished, and the psychological toll deepened. The avalanche not only robbed them of lives, but also destroyed any illusion of stability. They were vulnerable from every direction: mountain, snow, sky, and hunger. Several times, groups of survivors attempted to hike out of the valley, but the surrounding mountains were treacherous. The altitude and exhaustion made every step agonizing. They had no climbing gear, no maps, and no clear sense of direction. Eventually, 2 of the strongest survivors, Fernando Peredo and Roberto Canessa, volunteered for a final desperate trek. They trained themselves by taking short hikes around the crash site, slowly building stamina. They fashioned makeshift sleeping bags from aircraft insulation and clothing. After 2 months stranded, they set out across the snow in December. The journey was brutal. For 10 days they climbed through freezing winds, endured snow blindness, and nearly starved. At one point they reached the summit of a peak, believing rescue was just beyond it, only to see endless small mountains stretching to the horizon. But they pushed on, driven by sheer willpower. Finally, they descended into lower terrain and spotted signs of life: a river, then cattle, and eventually a man. The man, Sergio Catalan, was a Chilean muleteer. He could not cross the river to reach them, but he threw food across and promised to bring help. On December the 22nd, 1972, 72 days after the crash, the world finally learned that survivors were alive in the Andes. Peredo and Canessa had led rescuers back to the crash site. Helicopters were dispatched to the remote valley, and over the course of 2 days, all 14 remaining survivors were airlifted to safety. The ordeal left lasting scars, both physical and emotional. Survivors suffered frostbite, malnutrition, and lifelong trauma. Many had nightmares and struggled to find words for what they had endured. Yet, amid the pain, something extraordinary emerged. A bond so deep that it went beyond friendship. They had seen one another at their weakest, their most desperate, and their most human. Together they had endured nights of freezing darkness, days of hunger, and moments when hope seemed gone forever. Out of that crucible, they became more than teammates or travelling companions. They became family. Even decades later, when they gathered, the connection was instant. No explanation was needed. No outsider could ever fully grasp the language of looks, the shared silences, and the unspoken understanding between them. They had survived side by side, and that survival wove them together for life. Books, documentaries, and films retold their story. The most famous was Alive, a book published in 1974 and later adapted into a 1993 film titled Alive, the Miracle of the Andes. Another more recent retelling, the 2023 Spanish-language film Society of the Snow, La Sociedad de la Nieve, depicted the tragedy with haunting realism. They called the experience La Tragedia de los Andes. Yet, for the 16 who walked out, it was also proof of human resilience, determination, and the will to live against all odds. The crash of Flight 571 is not just a survival story. It's a mirror held up to human nature, showing both our fragility and our strength. Stripped of everything, these young men and women fought the mountain, the cold, and their own consciousness, and they walked out of the Andes to tell the tale.